Today we move into the last topic I'm going to cover in Unit 3, market failures that require government intervention and government failures when that intervention turns out to have unintended consequences. There will be no problem sets with this quiz and just a couple of pretty simple graphs. That's the good news. You will, however, have 2 quizzes, both of which will remain open only up until the day before the unit test, and both of which you may work on with partners. Indeed, I encourage that. These are mostly, though not entirely, reading quizzes, since I want to approach this topic as much as possible through case studies. But you will have questions on some of the material I'm going to cover in this podcast, so I recommend you take notes. We've really already begun this topic by looking at the minimum wage. One of the ways that free markets arguably fail is that the forces of supply and demand, marginal revenue product, and all that left to work on their own unchecked create a society with big disparities between top and bottom income earners. Outside of a few libertarians who don't believe in government intervention and a few socialists who don't believe in free markets, most of the debate, at least in the United States, comes down to how we can help those at the bottom levels of income without significantly reducing economic growth and without discouraging employment. Some people believe that higher minimum wages are a good way to address market failures of inequity by forcing employers to pay more. Some people think that the minimum wage is a bad way to address inequity and argue that the earned income tax credit, which are basically tax rebates for low-income workers, or assistance programs such as food stamps, are a better way to address inequity. That's some of what you worked on this week, right? You will see a couple more reading excerpts about this issue on your quizzes. But for now, I just want to note that inequity is one of our 4 rationales that economists generally cite as justifying government intervention in free markets. I'm going to come back to this slide, and you will need to be able to identify all 4 of these justifications for government intervention and to see which one applies. But for now, let's turn to another example of market failure. So, after you've watched this clip, or as you watch this clip, see if you can identify which of these 4 sources of market failures you're seeing reported. Well, the burning sensation experienced by residents living near the Sriracha hot sauce factory is an example of an externality. I'll explain what that means by using another example. Well, you see my second example here. It's the noise emitted by car alarms. I lived for a decade on the south side of Chicago when my husband was teaching at the University of Chicago. Our neighborhood did have a car theft problem, and not coincidentally, it had a lot of cars equipped with car alarms. As a mother of, at the time, 3 small children, I had an anti-car theft problem. Car alarms would often go off 5 or 6 times a night, right outside my kids' windows, which looked out on the street. Well, at any rate, without intervention, the producers and consumers of hot sauce or car alarms do not really have to pay the full cost of the product that they are producing or consuming. That is, they do not pay the costs that are borne by the wider society, including people who do not directly consume their products. That's what makes these costs externality. They are external to the basic market exchange between producers and consumers. Externality is a very useful analytical concept, and another one up there with opportunity cost and marginal revenue products you can get a raise that you might actually try to keep in your hard drives after this course is done. So, I warned you there would be a couple of graphs. This is one, and it's pretty straightforward. The green line represents the marginal cost curve facing a producer of hot sauce or car alarms or some product, say, made in a factory that emits huge clouds of black smoke into the air. This is the kind of marginal cost curve we've seen in this course so far. The blue line is good old demand for that product. The red line represents the marginal cost of that product that includes not only the resources that are used in producing it and therefore aren't available for producing other goods, remember opportunity cost, but it also includes the cost that the product imposes on society. Consumers, of course, don't necessarily care about the cost that the product they're buying imposes on society. People who buy hot sauce in another state are not affected by chemicals that the factory spews into the air. They want more hot sauce at lower prices. Car alarms are a little more complicated since the car owners may live in the same neighborhood as the people who hear them, but the car alarm manufacturer and the car alarm purchaser doesn't have to pay for my pain and suffering when the product goes off at 2 a.m. under my kid's window. Unless, that is, government somehow intervenes to add the social cost to the product. Note that when the social cost is factored in, the equilibrium price, where marginal social plus regular cost equals demand, that the equilibrium price of the good gets higher and less of it is produced, so the equilibrium quantity is reduced. Even the most ardent free market economist would say that this is an appropriate and necessary response. However, most economists also argue that there are better and worse ways, or in their language, more efficient, cost-effective, and less efficient, less cost-effective ways for governments to force producers and consumers to pay the social costs or externalities of the goods they produce and consume. Externalities can be positive as well as negative. So if my neighbor invests considerable money and hours of hard work to create a beautiful front garden, I can walk by it and enjoy it for free. I'm what economists call a free rider. My neighbor's garden is an entirely harmless positive externality. If anything, my neighbor might even derive some utils from my enjoyment and admiration of his or her work. But there are problems with positive externalities. The free market may not create as much of products that have positive externalities as the community actually needs, since the free riders aren't paying, and therefore they don't affect the equilibrium price by pushing up demand. A common example, one that economists like to use, since many of them, of course, are professors, is education. My neighborhood, as it happens, is about to vote on increasing funds for the very good local schools. As it happens, I don't think there is a single person on my immediate block who has school-aged kids. That doesn't mean my neighbors won't vote to pay the higher taxes to educate other people's kids, but it's easy to imagine that they might choose not to. Yet there is very strong evidence that everyone in the community and the country benefits from an educated citizenry and workforce. So taxing even non-consumers to pay for education makes sense as a government intervention. We'll return to free riders when we get to public goods, which is closely related to positive externalities. But it's still a somewhat different justification for government intervention. So I don't find my neighbor's garden or my community's kids hard case positive externalities to address. Here is a trickier example. Let's assume, for argument's sake, there are disagreements on this subject, but I'm not going there. Let's assume that organic farmers who do not use chemical fertilizers or pesticides provide an economic benefit to society: cleaner water, fewer dead birds, etc. If you walk into the organic produce section of the supermarket, you will see one obvious effect of choosing to farm organically. Organic fruits and vegetables cost more money, and they cost more money because producing them has higher marginal costs. Farmers adopted those chemical fertilizers and pesticides for a reason. They made it possible to produce more produce more cheaply. So these charts are from a survey conducted by Colby College students in Waterville, Maine in 2011. Price differences between organic and inorganic produce are not always this great, I realize that, but generally speaking, organic produce costs more. So, if we wanted to try to capture the social benefits of organic farming, we'd have some choices in our form of government intervention. One approach would be to place a tax on non-organic produce that's equal to its social cost, so that organic products would cost the same or even less. Another approach would be to subsidize purchases of organic goods so that their prices would be reduced to the same levels in organic goods, essentially so that social benefit would be factored into the price. That's what this graph shows. You see the welfare gain in black. That's what, at the new subsidized price QSO, or socially optimal, society as a whole would gain, but there would be opportunity cost. That is, whatever else consumers and or society would have been able to acquire with the resources that are used up by the subsidy or the tax. An easier, but probably less efficient, more hidden, therefore politically more popular way of addressing this would be to simply ban the sale of produce grown with chemical pesticides. Consumers would still have an opportunity cost. That would be the resources they're expending on fruits and vegetables that they might have expended on something else. But what's really interesting is that there might actually be a social cost of this kind of decision, even though it was designed to produce social benefits. With higher prices for produce, some consumers, and especially lower income consumers who are more price sensitive, would switch to cheaper processed foods. Why buy expensive organic broccoli when you can buy inexpensive potato chips? That has a social cost as well, in terms of obesity and all the public health problems it creates. So this is actually one of the most important and serious lessons I'm trying to teach you, silly cartoon notwithstanding. Almost any form of government intervention designed to address some kind of market failure has consequences for opportunity costs, and they're often consequences that undermine the good intentions of people who are trying to address a very real problem. So economists don't just talk about market failure. They actually talk about government failure as well. Some economists would argue that the minimum wage is a good example of government failure and the law of unintended consequences. A law designed to help low-income workers just puts a lot of them out of work. As you know by now, other economists and a lot more ordinary people disagree with that assessment. However you ended up or will end up coming down on that question, you should think about the full range of the consequences of a government action and try to think creatively. Oops, sorry about that. Hit my mouse inadvertently. There we go. Before I leave the topic of externalities, I want to warn you that one of your 2 reading quizzes will explore a debate that is very much alive and well among economists and politicians. What is the best way to capture the social costs of carbon emissions, an externality, and to reduce these emissions? I'm not going to dive into the debate over global warming. This discussion in your readings basically assumes that reducing carbon emissions would benefit society and acknowledges that policies to reduce emissions all impose opportunity costs, sometimes quite heavy opportunity costs. So the question is, what is the best way to do it? What policies create the most social benefit at the lowest opportunity cost? The president has proposed what is called a cap and trade system, where a cap is placed on carbon emissions and existing carbon producers get a permit to produce carbon. It's called grandfathering in. Usually they get to produce about the level they already are. They can also sell permission to produce carbon to other carbon producers. Other economists think that a flat-out carbon tax that adds the social cost of carbon emissions to the cost of carbon-emitting products, such as gas or coal, is a more efficient approach. Both proposals have run into a lot of political opposition since they would both clearly raise costs for producers and consumers. So they'd have an effect on employment. They would have an effect on economic growth. So I'm assigning, as part of your second quiz, and won't be the only thing on your second quiz, a couple of very good analyses from the London School of Economics on this question. These were published by the British newspaper The Guardian, a left-leaning newspaper, a serious newspaper, and they were published in a format that was intended for intelligent people who know some economics but who do not necessarily speak calculus as their first language. This is not an easy topic, but it is a very important topic for your future. So dig in and work with partners to figure out this debate. Maybe even think about where you stand. It is an issue that is not going to go away. So here, oh dear, one of those building graphs. Here is the second of the 2 graphs that you're getting in this lesson. It's a good review for your unit test. So let's assume that this is a supply marginal cost graph for electric power production, say a carbon and particulate belching coal-fired power plant. If the price of a kilowatt hour is the blue line, then the plant will produce at a point A where marginal cost equals marginal revenue or price. But this marginal cost may not capture the social costs of production, specifically the pollution that it produces. Now we see a change. Oh, I like the way that one built. Let's assume that the government has intervened and required the firm to install scrubbers in its smokestacks, or the government has imposed a carbon tax, or the government has required the plant to buy carbon permits in a cap and trade scheme. One of these approaches might be more cost effective than another, but all of these approaches would raise marginal costs and raise average total costs. So now the firm produces at point B and profits have declined. There we see it. Of course, since these regulations would presumably be enforced over lots of plants, the price would not stay the same. Here's the first graph I showed you. Over the entire market, if marginal costs go up to include social costs, then the price of electricity generated would go up and the quantity produced would go down, which is just what most analysts expect as a result of new restrictions on emissions by coal-burning plants, and what a lot of economists say needs to happen if we're going to have the economic incentives we need in the market to reduce carbon emissions. A lot of people are also, however, predicting that under the current regulations, supply may prove inadequate. In other words, the standards may be so tight, particularly given how hard it is to get regulatory permits to build new power plants, and because we keep acquiring more and more electronic items that need to be charged. This is a serious issue. My guess is it's going to be a very big issue in the coming decade. So the third market failure justification for government intervention is simpler, so I can go faster. I've really already talked about it to some extent. Most city parks don't have walls around them or gates that you have to enter. If you want to picnic or on the grass or play on the swings, you can do it for free. Or now that you've studied economics, you can do it for zero marginal cost. Similarly, I'm defended by the U.S. military from foreign attack because I live in the United States. Suppose I wanted to get out of the defense share of my taxes and say, well, I'll just take my chances against ISIS or Al-Qaeda. It doesn't make any sense. The Army can't draw a circle around me and say Mrs. McConnell does not need protection, and the IRS is not going to let me off the hook. It shouldn't let me off the hook. I've said we'd be coming back to free riders, so here we are. Basically, we use the government's coercive taxing power to make people pay for public goods. But there is some room for debate even here. So many economists argue that the government could effectively charge the actual consumers or beneficiaries for some supposedly public goods. So, for example, E-ZPass systems have made toll charges on roads much less inexpensive and inconvenient. I am not sure why museum goers get in free to the Smithsonian museums in Washington when they have to pay almost everywhere else. Although I certainly enjoyed that perk back when I was in Washington. Sorry, that turned out a little fuzzy, but now that I've thrown a lot of economics terms at you, let's watch a free rider at work. Believe it or not, I own a book on the economics of The Simpsons. It's really quite a great book. If there were more Simpsons episodes readily available on YouTube, I might have let Homer, or at least Lisa, teach you a lot more of this class. So, the final market failure justification for government intervention, often cited by economists, is excessive market power. You've seen this graph before. I used to call it the ugly graph, and in my monopoly lecture, I think I call it the squirrely graph. You only need to know how to interpret this graph in any detail if you're gunning for extra points on the Unit 3 test. But what you do need to know is that the profit maximizing point of production for a monopolist, letter D, translates into lower quantities at higher prices than the profit maximizing point of production for a competitive market, which would be E. That's not the American dream. Less stuff at higher prices. And that's why monopolies are not good for consumers or for economic efficiency, and why excessive concentrations of market power are viewed as a market failure. So, as a simple summary, monopolies charge prices that are higher than are socially optimal, and they produce lower quantities than are socially optimal. So, I am not, this is one of the things I've cut out in this class by having to shorten it. Oops, I went back too much. I'm not going to talk in any detail at all about antitrust power. You've studied OPEC's efforts to maintain market power. I still hope some of you will jump into the net neutrality debate. It's probably the most important market power issue that our government and citizens are grappling with right now. So what do you need to know? You need to know that antitrust policy is the policy of the government to address market power. It's done by a number of different agencies, in particular the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. Now we get to this slide. Oops, except now I'm going in the wrong direction. There we go. That finishes my lectures for Unit 3, except for the test review podcast. You have 2 reading quizzes for this lesson, and they will close the day before the test in the afternoon because I want to be able to open all of the quizzes for you to be able to review. And that means you have significantly less time than usual to get these done. I'm leaving them open-ended in terms of time. In other words, you don't have a time limit where you have to be, the time that you have to start and then finish, but you will not have a very long time to get these submitted for a grade. I'm hoping that you'll have time in class to finish them both, especially when you can consult with partners. Personally, don't time out before graduation, please. Remember that the grade for this class accompanies the credit on your transcript. Think of this not as the end of high school, but as the beginning of the transcript you'll show future employers or graduate schools. So don't let your energy drink out just when you're so close to the end.